So thanks very much, everyone, for coming to the seminar, and thanks to Bernie for joining us again. This is the second part of a two-part colloquium. The occasion for the colloquium was a couple of papers on radio galaxies that Bernie published, one of them recently. And I think last time he told us mostly about the papers and the history that led up to them. I think this time he's going to explain why it took him so long between the two papers. So please, questions after the talk, or put your questions in the chat box and we'll ask them after the talk. And otherwise, I'm gonna share the presentation. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the floor is yours, Bernie.
Thank you very much. Let me just warn you, this is not about radio astronomy. It's about South African history. So those of you who are not interested in South African history, now's your chance to bail out. Secondly, let me say this is my version of South African history. A lot of people would disagree with me, and a lot of people would interpret it differently. And I'm sure George would remember the facts better than I do. So Oleg has already asked Rob to give his version of the history, and I'll look forward to hearing that. I think by and large, Rob will agree with my version of a lot of it. I'm sure not all of it, though. So with those provisos that this is about history, not radio astronomy, and this is my version of it, let me take you through it. So we ended the last colloquium with the Mandela dictum that Mandela said it always seems impossible until you do it. And then my version of that, which is the next slide, Oleg, which is you got beyond the horizon what should be done but looks impossible. And as you'll see as we go through the slides, there's some things that I thought impossible, but we did them anyway. So as I said to you last time, one of the important things is seize the day and apologize later. And you've got to have a vision, and you've got to be prepared to work hard and for a long time to achieve your vision. Okay, Oleg, let's go to the next one. So this is a bit of background about South African history. I'm only starting in 1910. That doesn't mean that South African history started in 1910. Of course, as we said in the last colloquium, Homo sapiens, modern human beings, started in Africa and particularly in Southern Africa. And there's a lot of evidence that intellectual activity and technical and technology started in Southern Africa. But I'm going to start this talk from 1910. So after the Boer War, at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a process of what was called Anglicization, where the British colonialists tried to get everybody to be British. Didn't really work. And they eventually set up what they called the Union of South Africa in 1910, which put together the Cape Colony and the Transvaal Republic and the Free State Republic and so on. Natal was a colony as well. So that came together as a Union of South Africa, but of course they excluded all black people. They retained some minor parliamentary representation for so-called colored people and African people, but mainly it was a union of white people. So racial discrimination has been well entrenched in South Africa, going back long before that in colonial times. But of course, once diamonds and then gold were found in South Africa, there was a need for cheap labor. So racial discrimination was strengthened to ensure that the mines could be exploited with cheap labor. Diamonds were found in 1867. Those were alluvial diamonds from the Orange River. But the big blue ground diamond pipes were found in the early 1870s, and Kimberley grew up around what's now called the Big Hole. And for a long time, 95% of the world's diamonds were consolidated into the company De Beers, which was owned by Anglo-American and the Oppenheimer family. And an interesting comment that until about 20 years ago, most of the world's diamonds were marketed through De Beers, including Russia's diamonds, even though Russia and South Africa were definitely enemies in those days. Nonetheless, they sold their diamonds through De Beers. Then, of course, gold was discovered in 1886 in Johannesburg, which started as a mining camp, grew up around the gold mines. And these were by far the biggest gold mines in the world. They provided a huge percentage of the world's gold, as the diamond mines around Kimberley provided a big percentage of the world's diamond mines. So in order to ensure there was cheap labor, the pass laws were introduced, making it difficult for Black people to move around the country. And that was a way of ensuring that they got cheap labor. And then because the mining industry needed industry, South Africa up to that time had been largely agricultural with some trade, but they had to establish an engineering industry, and then they had to establish Eskom to provide electricity, and that all grew up around the mining industry, especially the gold mining industry, which stretched east and west from Johannesburg along what was called the reef. And a few mining companies gradually began to dominate the economy. So at the beginning, there were lots of little miners. They were gradually bought up by people like Cecil Rhodes, Werner Beit, Ernest Oppenheimer, Barney Bonato, and they consolidated these small mines into big mining houses. And by the middle of the last century, a few mining houses dominated the South African economy. The biggest was Anglo-American. There was also Anglo-Vaal and Goldfields. De Beers, as I said, was part of Anglo-American. And Anglo owned almost everything. They owned the breweries, they owned farms, they owned food processing, they owned OK Bazaars, they owned the steel industry, except for ISCOR. They owned engineering, they owned a lot of the auto manufacturing, so they were everywhere. And the Afrikaners felt excluded. And there was a lot of antagonism between Afrikaans and English communities following the Boer War. And the Afrikaners in the 1930s established Sanlam as a way of getting Afrikaans farmers and workers and others to invest in an Afrikaans company, and they could use that capital to invest in other companies. And then Anglo-American, with its current owner, Harry Oppenheimer, in the 1950s helped the Afrikaners to establish their own mining company so that they could reduce the hostility towards the English-speaking mining companies. And they established Federal and Mainbow. Remember that in the Second World War, there was a lot of opposition to South Africa's participation on the side of the Allies. And the Ossewa Brandwag, which was an extremist Afrikaans organization, favored working with the Nazis. Then after the Second World War in 1948, the National Party was elected to government, and they then established apartheid as a formal policy of government. And they introduced things like the Group Areas Act and so on, which meant that people of different races could only live in certain areas. Okay, Oleg, next slide. So in the 1950s, there were a number of persecutions of people who worked in the African National Congress and the Liberal Party and so on, who were seen as being opposed to apartheid. And that culminated in the treason trial in the 1950s. More than 100 people were put on trial, including Nelson Mandela. They were eventually acquitted of treason. Then in 1960, there was a protest against passes, and the Pan-Africanist Congress organized a demonstration at the police station in Sharpeville, which is near Vereeniging. And there was a massacre there. The police fired on the crowd. about 70 people were killed. And then the government declared a state of emergency and detained hundreds of people. And the ANC and other political organizations, the Communist Party, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and so on, were banned. And many leaders of the Congress movement were detained or they went into exile, including the leadership of the Congress of Trade Unions. So the Congress movement consisted of the African National Congress, which was for Black African people, the Indian Congress, the Colored People's Congress, and what was called the Congress of Democrats for whites. And it also had its own trade union movement called the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. And the government then introduced more and more repressive laws. The first one they introduced was a law that gave them power to detain people without trial in solitary confinement for 90 days. And I'm sure Rob will tell you when he gives his talk what it's like to be in solitary confinement. And then that was extended to 180 days. And then the Terrorism Act was introduced, which in effect gave the security police the ability to detain people indefinitely without trial and without access to lawyers or anybody else. Okay. So in the early 1970s, 1972, 1973, there were very big strikes in the gold mines around Joburg and then in Durban over a living wage. Remember that people were being paid very, very little in those days. And working in the mines was also a terrible job. The average fatality rate in the gold mines in the 1970s was about 750 fatalities a year. So from these very big strikes, people in Durban established what they call the General Factory Workers Benefit Fund to start to bring workers together. And from that, they started to organize industrial unions in Durban, starting with the Metal and Allied Workers Union, the National Union of Textile Workers, and the Chemical Workers Industrial Union. And these were brought together in a federation called the Trade Union Advisory and Coordinating Committee. The unions were very different to unions that had been established previously. So the unions that had belonged to the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU, were seen to be part of the Congress movement. And it can be argued that their main role was to bring workers into the political parties. The unions that were established in 1974 were explicitly non-racial, so anybody could join them, and they were independent of political parties for two reasons. One is that our view was that anybody who wanted to join the union, irrespective of what political party he or she belonged to, should be free to join the union as long as they supported the union. And secondly, we felt that to become overtly political at a time of great repression when the security police were very powerful was just to invite trouble. So we believed that we had to organize strongly at the shop floor. And remember that union organizers had no access to the factories. We had to hide in the bushes outside the factories and organize people one by one going into the townships. And our motto was each one organize one. So it was a very slow and difficult process, but we believed that we had to stay away from the political parties because then the state would just crack down on us. So in 1975, we established branches in the Transvaal, which was the province around Joburg. And then more and more unions started to come into this group of unions. There was another organization called TAXA, the Trade Union Congress of South Africa. And that had a lot of very conservative unions, which were established in terms of the law, the Labor Relations Act. The Industrial Relations Act. And those unions were for different races. So Black workers had no legal rights to join a union, and they were excluded from the bargaining system. So the annual negotiations, which were held in what were called industrial councils, only covered white and so-called colored and Indian workers. So some of the unions from Tuxa broke away from Tuxa, and they came together with our non-racial independent unions. And in 1979, the Federation of South African Trade Unions was established. The biggest unions which came into that from outside were the Auto Workers Union and the Sweet and Food Workers Union. And then there was more and more unity between unions. And in 1985, COSATU was established, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And that again was much wider than COSATU. It included a lot of unions that had come up through a different organization. One of them was the National Union of Mine Workers. The General Secretary was Cyril Ramaphosa. And then one of the policies of COSATU was that all the different unions in an industry had to come together so that you would have unity of workers in that one industry. So the National Union of Metal Workers was established in 1987, and that the biggest union that went into that was the Metal and Allied Workers Union, where I was an organizer, and then the Auto Workers Union, the Electrical Workers Union, the General and Allied Workers Union, and a couple of others. So gradually there was a process of workers being unionized and coming together, and then the unions being brought together. And the Metal and Allied Workers Union started, as I said, in 1974. We started with a couple of thousand members, but by the beginning of the 1980s, we already had about 300,000 members. And at the beginning, we had no access to the factories. I remember one factory in particular in Kew, which is part of Johannesburg, near Alexandra. There was one factory called Craft Engineering, where the owner of the factory said he would never talk to unions because unions are the work of the devil, and he was religious and he would never talk to Satan. So it was not easy. And Dunswart Iron and Steel Works near Benoni, every time they saw us, they called the security police. And remember, in those days, also workers had no rights. So they could fire anybody anytime for joining a union. They could fire you even if they didn't like the look on your face. So workers had no rights. Wages were very, very low. And the security police were very active. Okay, next slide. Then in 1976, there was the uprising by the school children. It started in Soweto, and then it rapidly spread across the rest of the country. And this is a picture of how the police used to patrol in the townships. You can see they're carrying their R1 rifles, automatic rifles, and they were not slow to shoot. If they saw people on the street that they didn't like, they were quick to shoot them. So we had a bit of a problem then because we'd started organizing in 1974. Because we didn't have any offices, we used to go and hold meetings at people's homes in the townships. Then we got offices, but we still had to take people home after meetings at night because there were no taxis in those days, and there were certainly no buses or anything else. So we used to drop people door to door. And of course, in 1976, when everything was closed down, there was a state of emergency. It became very difficult and very dangerous. So we had to stop organizing for a month or so, but then we started again, and we just had to be careful that the police didn't see us. Okay, next slide. So because we didn't have any offices, a lot of our meetings were held in the veld. This is a picture of a strike of the Metal and Allied Workers Union at a company called Stocks and Stocks, which sort of still existed. I think it's recently gone bankrupt in the last year or so, in a place called Clayville, near the airport, near Joburg Airport. And it was owned by this company called Stobar. They made reinforcing steel. You can see me in the background there. Because we didn't have access to company premises, it was hard to negotiate. So we had to negotiate as best we could at the factory gates. Can we go to the next slide? So we put a lot of emphasis on workplace organization and democracy. And we insisted that workers understand their union and that they must control the union. The unions in the past had been controlled by the officials from their head offices. We said, no, it doesn't work that way. Workers must control their own unions. They must take the decisions. So in every factory, they had to elect shop stewards, which was really based on the old British model from the 1920s. And the shop stewards had to have meetings with their members every week. And then we insisted that they hold general meetings of all the members every month, which used to work in the 1970s. Nowadays, I think most of the unions have dropped those traditions. They don't really have that strong shop floor organization. And then because we grew so fast, we started to say to workers, look, we haven't got enough organizers to go to every factory. You must organize the other workers in your industrial area. So we developed what we called shop steward councils, where the shop stewards in each area would meet every week in the union offices. We had offices by that time, and they would organize each other and help each other solving their problems, and only call in the organizers where they couldn't solve their problems. So you can see in the top picture there is a meeting, a weekly meeting of the Shop Stewards Council in one of our offices. I think that was in Katlehong near Germiston. And then at the bottom, there's a general meeting of workers in the township. You can see that we didn't have very fancy offices. We had to use whatever halls or spaces were available. I used to go out on a Sunday morning for meetings in the townships, and they'd say, we've got to meet early because we've got to go to church. So we want to meet at 6 o'clock. So I'd get there at 6 o'clock at somebody's house. And of course, nobody would turn up. And I'd sit and read the Sunday Times for a couple of hours, and we'd start at about 9 o'clock. Okay, next meeting. Next slide, sorry. So this is a picture of the Metal and Allied Workers Union delegation. That was from our National Executive Committee. In the front row, you can see two women. There were not a lot of women in the metal industry in those days. The one on the right is Juno's Nala. She was the General Secretary. The old man next to her on the extreme right of the bottom row is Baba K. He was about 50 when the union was started. He died at 93 a couple of years ago in Swaziland. But these were people who gave their lives to the union. Their entire lives were taken up by the union. They worked nearly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can see me top left-hand corner. I was a bit younger in those days. I had longer hair too. And then we, in 1983, the Metal and Allied Workers Union joined the National Industrial Council for the Iron, Steel, Engineering and Metallurgical Industry. And this became possible because in 1980, government realized that they couldn't continue with the growth of the black unions, which were not regulated by law. So they saw the unions of black workers growing very fast. As I say, we had more than 300,000 members by that time. In fact, we grew to about 450,000. So they established a commission called the Vihan Commission, and then they wrote laws which gave African workers the right to participate in the national negotiating structures and gave African workers some rights for the first time. So in 1983, we joined the Industrial Council. There was a big debate because some people said we're going to become bureaucratic and workers won't control anymore. It'll be controlled by the officials. But we decided that there were too many advantages to stay out of it. And in fact, joining the Industrial Council was wonderful because there were a lot of white unions there, and they always sold out eventually for a low increase. And we would say to workers, look, these guys have sold you out again, you better come and join MAU. Then, of course, we became the majority union. Then it wasn't so easy because the Industrial Council agreement had to be signed by the biggest union. And if we said, well, we don't want to sign, then there was no wage increase that year. So then we were in the difficult position where we actually had to reach agreement. Anyway, you can see me down there, bottom right-hand corner. I had a beard in those days. Again, I was younger. Okay, most of the people in that picture are workers, not officials, because we said there must be a majority of workers on any delegation. Okay, next picture. So in 1985, the MeerKAT organization in Natal, which was run by Gacha Buthelezi, who is still around, as you've probably seen in the newspapers recently, began to feel very uncomfortable because the unions were becoming very strong. And in 1983, the United Democratic Front had been established, which brought together progressive organizations across the country. The ANC was still banned. The UDF was informally aligned with the ANC. And so the UDF and the unions were getting more and more support in Natal, and MeerKAT became very uncomfortable. So they started attacking union members and UDF members. And in 1985, we'd had a big strike in a town called Howick, which is near Pietermaritzburg, in a British factory called Samco. All the workers are fired. We carried on a campaign there for years to get them reinstated. They were reinstated about 10 years later. But the guys in the picture were all kidnapped by MeerKAT and murdered. They were shot and then burned in a car. And fighting spread throughout the country. Some of you may know about that. I think most of you weren't born in those days, but it spread up to Johannesburg and the Witwatersrand. There were killings in the trains, in the commuter trains. A bunch of people would get on the trains and kill people and throw them out the doors. One of our organizers was a guy called Sam Ntuli in Katlehong, and he was an organizer who helped to organize the self-defense units. He was eventually murdered, and this is a picture of his funeral. And on the lower left-hand side, you can see the MeerKAT impis marching to attack township residents. And of course, they were protected by the police. So what used to happen was that the police would sweep through the township, confiscate any weapons they found, and then half an hour later, the MeerKAT impis would arrive. Okay, next. So it wasn't only MeerKAT though. You'll remember at that time that South Africa had been split up into what we call the Bantustans. The apartheid government pretended that there were independent states of the different tribes. So they had one in Leboa, and Bophuthatswana was for the Tswana people, and KwaZulu was for the Zulu people, and Transkei and Ciskei were for the Xhosa people, and so on. And of course, this was all nonsense. They didn't really have any independence. But Bophuthatswana had its own police force. And there was a township called Okasi, which is on the edge of Brits, which is near Pretoria. And they tried to force the people to leave Okasi to move into Bophuthatswana. And the union led the resistance against that. And the Bophuthatswana police then started murdering people. And they threw a nail bomb into the window of the house of one of our organizers, David Modimoeng, in 1986. And they killed his wife. And this is a picture of the funeral. You can see in the background there, you can see hundreds of police vans and army trucks. And we thought they were going to shoot us, but in the end they didn't. So we marched up from David's house to the graveyard. That happened on the 12th of June, 1986. We were going to have a big demonstration on the anniversary of the Soweto uprising on 16th of June. But on the night of the, on the night of the 12th of June, the state declared a state of emergency. And when we drove into Okasi, we could see the security police sitting. There was only one road in and out of most townships, so the state could control access. So Katlehong, there was one road, Natalspruit, Thokoza, and then also in Brits, in Okasi was just one road. So they didn't stop people going in, but coming out, they had their lists and they stopped all the cars and they took people out and they put them in detention, and we didn't see those people again for about 12 months. Okay. Next slide. So that state of emergency was very repressive. They arrested hundreds of people, held them in detention without trial, but they also prevented any news reports, and they cut people off. So the detainees had no right to access to a lawyer. They had no right to see anybody. They had no right to a doctor. They didn't even have the right to see the inspecting judge. There was a judge who was supposed to inspect prisons, and even he didn't have access to them. So Mao brought a case against the state president, P.W. Botha, and it was on behalf of one of our organizers, Willis Nkunu. Willis later became the premier of KwaZulu-Natal. Until quite recently, he was the premier there. And he was our organizer in Northern Natal, which was a very, very dangerous job. He and Mike Mabuyakulu, who's also been in the newspapers recently, were our organizers there. And Inkatha was very strong in Isitebi, the industrial area, and Richards Bay, and they were extremely brave. But Willis and Mike were both detained, so we brought a case to court on behalf of Willis to say that the government didn't have the power to declare a state of emergency. And if we couldn't win that, then we said Willis must get access to a lawyer and a doctor. And everybody was quite depressed because the state seemed to be all powerful. So there was, some of you know the Mail and Guardian. Those days was called the Weekly Mail. And at first they started reporting about people who were being detained. And then the state said, you can't do that. So then they would have a report, but with most of it blacked out. Then the state said, you're not allowed to have blacked out type. So then they had it just white blank spaces. They said, you're not allowed to do that. So there was no reporting, no news, no access to these people at all. So we went to court in the Supreme Court, and I made the affidavit. So it was in my name and Mao's name and Willis's wife's name, Dudu. And we, much to our surprise, we were represented by a very powerful advocate. And much to our surprise, although we lost the main case against the government declaring the state of emergency unlawful, we won the case that Willis could get access to a lawyer and a doctor. And of course, once Willis could get access, everybody else could too. So that changed the situation. People became more hopeful. And as you can see, this is a report of the judgment. The court refused to release 6 Mao officials from detention, but agreed that certain aspects of the definition of a subversive statement were unclear and unlawful, and the applicants could get contact with lawyers and doctors. So we can go to the next slide, please. At the same time, there was another very big case going on. In 1985, there was a very big treason case launched. So in 1983, the United Democratic Front and the union started working together. Up to that time, we hadn't been very friendly. But we started to have stayaways of workers and trying to make the townships ungovernable. And in 1983, we organized a huge stayaway of over 1 million workers. And the people who organized that stayaway were then arrested. And one of our Mao organizers, a guy called Moses Mayakiso, was arrested with Paul Mashatila, who's now the treasurer of the ANC, and Obed Bapela, who's a deputy minister, and Richard Mdakani, who is the chief whip, or was the chief whip of the ANC in parliament. Richard and Paul and Obed were leaders of the Alexander Youth Organization in Alexandra, and Moss, besides being a union organizer, had been organizing the Alexander Civic Organization. So they were all arrested and charged with high treason, and their case went on for about 3 or 4 years. And again, there's some wonderful work by our lawyers. We got them acquitted, and the judge, who was actually a very strong Nationalist Party supporter, said in the end of the case that if he had been in their position, he would have done what they did. So things were starting to turn in the late 1980s. Then we were generally troublemakers. So in 1990, let's just go to the next slide of it. Sorry, the one after that. Yeah. So in 1990, the negotiations between the ANC and the apartheid government led to the unbanning of the political parties. And I must say, I was out by about 30 years because I thought it wouldn't happen for about 30 years. So it just shows you should never trust what I tell you. But the reason why this came about is important, because a lot of people have been saying that Mandela sold out. And I think they misunderstand history. They think that the ANC marched into Pretoria at the head of an army and the apartheid state was defeated, but it didn't happen that way. What happened was that the debt that the South African apartheid state had accumulated had become unmanageable, and they couldn't borrow money because of financial sanctions against apartheid. And also the unions and the UDF had made the townships ungovernable. So the mass democratic movement couldn't win, and the apartheid state couldn't win, so there was a stalemate, and they realized that they had to negotiate. Then the Inkatha violence grew even more terrible. Eventually, a peace agreement was negotiated, and negotiations started for a democratic non-racial state and a new constitution. And the first election for a democratic state was held in April 1994, and Mandela was inaugurated as president on 10th of May 1994. Can you go back 2 slides of it, Oleg? So in that time, we decided that we wanted to take as much power from the nationalist apartheid government as we could, so that we could swing the balance of power during the negotiations. So in 1991, the government tried to introduce VAT, and we started a campaign. I chaired a committee which had 93 organizations. Everybody, as you know, hates tax. So the committee consisted of everybody from the Communist Party and a ZAPO on the one side to the Afrikaanse Weerstandbeweging, the AWB, on the other side. And we eventually had mass stay away, which I'll show you in a minute, which is about 3 million people stayed away. And the government then eventually negotiated a settlement. And all of the things that you can buy today, which don't have VAT on them, like fresh food and books and so on, is as a result of that campaign. Okay, next slide. So we had a lot of these big stayaways. When the government tried to change the Labour Relations Act in 1988, we pulled a stayaway with 3 million workers. You can see in the top picture. And in the march to oppose the implementation of VAT, we said we don't want VAT. It's an anti-progressive tax. You should rather tax the rich people. We called out a stayaway, and 3,700,000 people stayed away from work. So in those days, the unions and the UDF were quite powerful. Okay, next slide. And the one after. Then there was a long period of transition from 1990 to 1994. We had all kinds of planning, what we were going to do with the budget and how we were going to spend the budget on giving work to people and services that people hadn't had. I started a couple of campaigns, the anti-VAT campaign. I also discovered that the apartheid government was going to give away licenses to Vodacom and MTN. And I went to Jay Naidu, who was the General Secretary of COSATU, and said, the Nationalist Party is giving away the people's spectrum. And he said, what's a spectrum? So we started a campaign, and we eventually got them to give a lot of shares in Vodacom and MTN to NAFCOC and FABCOS, which were organizations of Black business people, and to the unions. And also negotiated that we got seats on the ESCOM board for the unions. So I sat on the ESCOM board 1992-93, representing the National Union of Metal Workers. Gwede Mantashe represented the National Union of Mine Workers. Then there was somebody representing the white unions. Dan Mofokeng represented the South African National Civic Organization. We also had something called the National Economic Forum. We negotiated about electricity distribution and about fuel prices and so on. Okay, yeah, let's go on to the next one. So the alliance came together after 1990 between the ANC, the unions, and the Communist Party. Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the General Secretary of the National Union of Metal Workers, was elected as the General Secretary of the ANC, and Jay Naidu was the General Secretary of COSATU. So that's a picture of them holding a press conference in 1992. Okay, next slide. So in the 1990s, we started to develop a program of rights for society, because we didn't trust any government really. So we started to develop what we called a workers' charter. The ANC had the Freedom Charter. We said we need a workers' charter to assert workers' rights. And that gradually became very popular and was taken up by this whole alliance. The ANC came on board, everybody came on board, and it was very widely discussed throughout South Africa. And when Mandela became president in 1994 and he appointed a government of national unity, the Reconstruction and Development Program became the program of government. And it has provision for reduction of inequality and poverty, creation of jobs, and so on. And Mandela created a minister without portfolio in the presidency and the Office for the Reconstruction and Development Program. And Jay Naidu became the minister, and I became the head of the Office for the RDP in the presidency. And the idea was to invest heavily in economic and social infrastructure to stimulate industry and economy and to deliver services. And we thought we'd get a lot of money from ending apartheid, and we would use it for the RDP. The first Minister of Finance was a guy called Derek Keyes, who had been the chief executive of the Industrial Development Corporation. Very, very smart guy. So he was part of the government of national unity. And he said no head of department in government will ever reprioritize their budget. So what he did was he took money off the top of everybody's budget and gave it to me and Jay. And he said, they can come and get it from you, but you've got to approve their projects and they've got to be in line with the Reconstruction and Development Program. And Mandela gave us 100 days to get the Reconstruction Development Program underway. We were very inexperienced. If we'd known what we were doing, we would have said, give us 1,000 days. There's no ways we can do it in 100 days. So we were very naive. And we worked very hard. We got a lot of projects on the ground, all the RDP projects for building housing and schools and the school feeding program and clinics and electrification and roads and water and so on. But we didn't realize how little capacity government had to run projects. They really didn't know how to run projects, not the old government or the new government. But the RDP fund was supposed to pay for these projects. So Derek Keyes took 13.9 billion rand off everybody's budget and gave it to us for 3 years. And the equivalent now would be about 60 billion rand. So it was a big fund. And so we were very popular because we had money to give away, but we were very unpopular because we'd taken other people's money. And a lot of the ministers hated Jay because they said, why is Jay a super minister? Why are we not as important as Jay is? And Thabo and Becky in particular resented Jay and me because he was trained in economics at Sussex University, and he said, Jay and Bernie don't know anything about economics. How come they're running economic policy? So he persuaded Mandela in 1996 to close the RDP office, and Jay was sent to become Minister of Telecommunications, and they closed the RDP policy and they replaced it with something called GEAR, Growth, Employment and Reconstruction, which was run by Trevor Manuel. And if you ask anybody what happened to GEAR, you'll realize it disappeared in a year or two. But I learned the hard way how government works. They stab you in the back very quickly. Okay, next one. So that's the Union Buildings, which is the President's office in Pretoria, and Tuynhuys is the President's office in Cape Town. And you can see on the east wing, on the left-hand side of the Union Buildings, Mandela's office was where the pillars are on the first floor. Jay's office was just above that on the second floor. And when Jay left, I had that office. I had the office just above Mandela. Okay, next slide. So as I told you last time, Mandela signed a certificate of appreciation for us. Unfortunately, they used poor ink, so I've disappeared from history. And this is a certificate of appreciation awarded to someone anonymous. But if you look carefully, you can see it says Bernard Fanaroff. The Masakani campaign on the right, we persuaded everybody not to pay service charges and not to pay rents in the townships to make the townships ungovernable. But when we became the government, then we wanted people to start paying. So we started the Masakani campaign, and that was coordinated by me as the head of the RDP office, a guy called Billy Cobbett, who is the ANC head of the housing department, the DG, and Neil Barnard, who was the head of the National Intelligence Agency. And my wife couldn't understand how I could have breakfast with Neil Barnard every Monday morning. I said, well, it's a government of national unity. What can we do? Okay, next one. Next slide, Eric. So because we realized government had no capacity to run projects, I got Eskom and Arms Corps and Murray and Roberts and Denell and so on to second people to us, the post office, all kinds of people, CSR, and this is the project management team. So we send project managers out to all the government departments and the provinces to help them to get their RDP projects underway. Only one department didn't want, that was the education department. They always thought they knew better than everybody else. And of course, you can see what happened as a result. Next slide. So everybody wanted to talk to us in the RDP office because we are the National Program of Government. This is just one example where I told Sasol and Moscas that they were going to lose their subsidies from government. Sasol had been privatized. It was a state-owned organization, then it was privatized. And this is me throwing my weight around. So we had a lot of fun in some ways. Okay, next slide. And that's the end of that history. And after that, the RDP office closed in 1996. Sidney Mufamadi, who is the Minister of State Security, asked me to move to the Department of Safety and Security, which was in charge of the police. So I worked with the police for another 3 years. And then in the year 2000, Jackie Salebi became the Commissioner of Police. He said he didn't want civilians to tell him what to do. So we were downgraded. And at that stage, I decided to leave government and I started a small consulting company. And then Rob Adam approved the SKA bid. And George Nicholson, who you can see in the picture there with Shireen Rawat, and Justin persuaded Khutsum Mukheli, who was the president of the NRF, that we should bid for the SKA. So they went to Rob. Rob said, how much will it cost? They said about 2 million rand. So Rob said, okay, but only on one condition. You've got to have somebody who runs a project, who knows something about government and about management. And that's how I got the job. So I'm happy to take any questions, and Rob may want to add to some of that.
Thanks very much, Bernie. That was absolutely fascinating. I can see a hand up. There's Simon.
Hi, Bernie. Thanks for the talk. That was very interesting. Just going back to what you were talking about, were like in the 60s and 70s, when you were talking about sort of the desire for cheap labor from monopolies. And I think, well, in my perspective, I kind of see this happening sort of again globally these days. You know, when you've got transnational corporations and neoliberalism just as a economic ideology that's sort of seems to have taken over, but no one seems to know how to take it on, especially because like you've got these big companies just stuffing money away in offshore tax havens and that kind of thing. So just, I guess I'd be interested in your opinion on how to deal with these kind of power structures.
So it's quite difficult to answer. Remember, at that time, the industry was very monopolized. So as I said, Anglo-American owned almost everything, and what they didn't own, Anglo-Val owned. You probably remember Anglo-Val owned a big part of the food industry, as well as gold mines. So almost everything, Federal and Mainbow became Gencor. Gencor owned a lot of things. In those days, the metal industry, for instance, was very highly concentrated. There were two big companies which owned almost everything, Anglo-American and Barlow's. And everybody had to belong to the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation, SEIFSA. And SEIFSA ran that industry. And SEIFSA was run by a guy called Graham Boustead, who was a director of Anglo-American. And when Boustead said jump, SEIFSA jumped. So the whole engineering industry was basically told what to do by Graham Boustead, until Barlow's decided that they didn't like the way he was doing things, and they started fighting with him. And that gave us a way in, because then there was a split between the different leaders of the steel industry. But after 1994, with the rise of the Competition Commission, those big companies were largely broken down. And that happened for a number of reasons. One is companies like Anglo-American decided that they'd rather be based in the UK or America or somewhere else. So Anglo's head office is now in London. And they took a lot of their capital out of the country, and they sold off a lot of their plants. And the metal industry, just as an example now, is very, very fragmented. I've been leading the development of the steel industry master plan. And in the old days, I could just speak to SEIFSA and I'd know what the industry wanted. Now I have to try and speak to 10,000 small employers. There are no very large companies left in the industry. In fact, there are no large steel construction companies. Genrec has died, Doorbell has died, Murray and Roberts has died, Barlow's Heavy Engineering has died. So the industry has become very fragmented. Also, a lot of our manufacturing capacity has been lost. And people are now, in large cases, just importing and putting their labels on things. So the auto industry, as you know, is dominated by the big original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs. And that's true of the mining industry as well, mining equipment. It's true of the food industry. It's true of a lot of other industries as well. But the globalization is something that is very hard to combat. And globalization has given these very large companies more and more power. And if you look at what's happened over the last 10, 20 years, inequality has grown more and more. And South Africa is now one of the most unequal nations in the world. But you've seen over the last 5 or 10 years, inequality in America has become more and more pronounced. And over the period of COVID, the techno companies have made huge increases in profits. People like Elon Musk, people like the guys who run Microsoft, the guys who run Google, they've earned huge profits and everybody else has become poorer. So, yeah, South African industry has changed its nature. A lot of things were privatized. SKA was privatized. Sasol, as I said, was privatized. And SKA, I can tell you, was privatized in a way that has destroyed the steel industry. ArcelorMittal, which is a worldwide company, has been very, very bad for the steel industry in South Africa. So, Simon, I can't really answer your question.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, but thanks for talking about it.
Right, thanks. We've got Fernando with a question and Etienne afterwards.
Bernie, I think last time you ended more or less with telling us that after you returned from Cambridge, I think you were at WITS as a lecturer or something for a couple of years. Can you just speak briefly to how this came about, your transition from leaving science to, well, to starting union organizing from a personal perspective?
So my parents were always involved with unions and night schools and so on. And I decided very early on that I also wanted to be involved in what you can loosely call the struggle. But I first wanted to get a PhD. So I did a PhD. Then I came back to South Africa to find a way to get involved in the struggle. And I looked around and couldn't really decide what was interesting. So I nearly went back to England. And then I discovered the people who were trying to establish the Transvaal branches of the unions, which had started in Durban. So then I started working with them for 1975 and 1976. But in the hours when George thought I was at the university and the university thought I was with George at Hartbeespoort, I was actually organizing people at the factories and in the townships. So I apologize, George, if you thought I was at the university when I wasn't. But then in 1976, after the June uprising by the school kids, all of the organizers of the unions were banned. You may know in those days there was a thing called a banning order, which was like a kind of house arrest order, and people would be banned for 5 years. And in 1974, all the organizers of these non-racial independent unions were banned. And again in 1976, all the organizers were banned. So I went to the university authorities and I said, can I have 2 years unpaid leave to go and work in the unions? And they said, no, it's not appropriate to your skills. So then I resigned from the university and I thought I would have the best of both worlds. I'd work for 2 years, then I'd be banned. I could go back to astronomy and then I would have done my duty and get back to astronomy. But they didn't ban anybody after that. So I ended up in the union for nearly 19 years instead of 2 years, and I didn't get back to astronomy.
Thanks, Bernie.
Thanks. Etienne, you have a question?
Yeah, this was a really fascinating talk. Thank you very much for your insights. I guess this is something of a compliment to Simon's question in that so basically, I'm interested, you have a very rich and unique perspective on the matter of organizing people in a very precarious, difficult situation. And obviously one of the struggles with this is state repression and international interests, but another is their organized crime, which works hand in hand with them, but often also in opposition with them. How would you say, do you think that fighting, how would you characterize the struggle organizing against, around, without organized crime in South Africa generally, and then after apartheid during Reconstruction? I'd be really interested in your insights on this question.
So, yeah, it's an interesting question. After 1990, after the liberation movements were unbanned, and then after 1994, when a lot of people left the security police, what happened was that the infiltration routes and the connections which both the security police and the liberation movements had in other countries began to be used by organized crime for taking stolen motor vehicles out of the country, for bringing weapons into the country, for bringing drugs into the country. So there was a lot of overlap. And I think a lot of people who are in the security police and in various organizations like the CCB, the hit squads, became part of organized crime. A big part of organized crime for many years has been the taxi industry. So what happened in the 1980s was that the apartheid state was being criticized for not being capitalist enough, because they didn't allow Black people to build up businesses. They allowed small businesses, but nothing more than that. And even that was very difficult. So there were very few Black businessmen. People like Richard Maponya were among very few of them, and Tato Motlana. But what they did was they then allowed the taxi industry to develop. But the taxi industry was never regulated by law. So it regulated itself through the barrel of a gun. And a lot of the violence in Natal, the violence that you see even now in Cape Town, is the taxi industry shooting people and shooting each other. And up to now, it's never been regulated, it's never been controlled, and it's always been a center of organized crime. And they don't pay taxes either. So there are all kinds of organized crime organizations which grew up around the security police, the liberation movements, the taxi industry. And I'm not quite sure what you want me to deal with. So I'm not sure if you want to follow up on that question.
I was just interested in how you felt you related to these organizations as an organizer before and after apartheid, because I know they're very present, for example, in a lot of what are generally called first world countries through various ways. Like in Italy, obviously, there's a famous example, and this collaborated greatly with America. In France, it's its whole other thing. But it seems that you're in a very unique position of having been both in emancipation movements, very vulnerable to these people, but still struggling on. And then, as you say, having to collaborate with some of the representatives through the spooks who worked with them and in large ways organized them through blah, blah, blah. I'm just interested in your perspective, essentially.
Well, we didn't really have anything to do with organized crime in the early days. Remember, in the townships, there were township gangs, but they were a different order of magnitude. They were basically people who robbed people when they were coming home from work on a Friday with their pay packets. And in the Cape Town townships, there were people who were running drugs, mainly mandrax in those days. But they never really had any serious interaction with the unions or influence on the unions. It was only much later that those became much more widespread, much more powerful. There were organized crime gangs in the community, I've no doubt, but we didn't have, well, I don't think we knowingly had anything to do with them.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting and good to know.
All right. There is a question from Isabella in the chat. Do you see it, Bernie?
Sorry, let me go down to that.
So I can read it out. Isabella is asking, how was it like leading people of color?
I can talk about that. So we tried very hard to emphasize that workers had to make every decision. Obviously, that didn't work exactly as we would have hoped it to, because officials always had to retain some central position and often could lead people. It was very rare that I found people opposed to me. There were two things that I must mention. In the early days of the unions, we came under a lot of attack from the ANC in exile, and in particular from SACTU in exile and the Communist Party in exile, because they said SACTU was the only legitimate organization representing workers, even though it was in exile. And if we were organizing unions, we must be agents of the apartheid state. So that was a bit unpleasant, but we said, well, okay, if that's what you think, that's what you think. We couldn't give up on it. And then in, must have been 1983 or somewhere around there, there was a split in the Metal and Allied Workers Union. And that split took place ostensibly around the question of whether the union should affiliate to the United Democratic Front. And some of us who were called workerists felt we shouldn't affiliate, and some of them thought they should affiliate. And the guys who thought the union should affiliate carried out what you might call a coup d'etat. So they branded some of us as agents of the state, white people who were agents of the state. And they said we were obviously trying to mislead workers and so on. Anyway, the union then split into two. And much to their surprise, 3,000 members left and went with them into their new union, and all the rest stayed with the old union. And when we asked people why they'd stayed with us and not gone with this guy, David Sababi, they said, because we know Bernie and we know Baba K and we know MeerKAT, and we know that they've got our interests at heart, so we stay with the people that we know and trust. So yeah, you know, I got on well with people by and large. I think some people didn't like me, but it was never a great problem. The only thing that I must say is, in those days, nobody ever said thank you to you. The only time I remember people saying thank you was one time when we'd had national negotiations for a company called Henry Fruhauf. They used to make the big road trailers, truck trailers, in Wadeville in Germiston, and they slaughtered a cow for me and MeerKAT at the end of the negotiations. But other than that, nobody ever said thank you. They only criticized us. They said, why haven't you done this more quickly? Why haven't you got us more money? And one story I'll tell you, in 1987, we had a very big strike in the metal industry. And everybody was very, very excited about it. So all the organizers and the National Executive Committee went to the factories and said, comrades, we're going out on strike. There's going to be a huge strike. And then after 3 or 4 weeks, we'd come to what we realized was about the limit. Everybody wanted a 50% wage increase, and we eventually got about 8 or 9%. And we had to then go back and say to people, guys, we've gone as far as we can go. It's not going to go any further. You better go back to work. And then everybody disappeared. And they said to me and Baba K, who was also an old guy, they said, go and tell the workers to go back to work, because the young ones were afraid that they'd be beaten up if they told workers after being out without any money for 3 weeks, and they only got 8 or 9% instead of 50%. So my experience was, as long as you are open and honest with people, they trusted you, and people are reasonable. You know, people don't look at you and say, well, you're a white guy, you must be lying to us. They say, we've worked with you, we know you, we trust you, you've been open with us, you've got our interests at heart. We'll work with you, it's fine.
Right.
Remember, this is my version. There must be other versions as well.
Right. Well, are there any more questions? I don't see any more hands up, but if someone wants a question, unmute yourself and ask. Oh, there is a comment from Nisa. Not a question, but a comment.
Where are we?
No, there's just a thank you comment from Nisa. That's nice. Well, Bernie, actually, I had a question. Well, one thing struck me when you said your estimate was off by 30 years.
Yeah.
It kind of chimed with what I felt when when the Soviet Union broke up, looking from the inside, because it
Yeah.
looked eternal one day, and then literally in the space of 3 days, it fell apart. So what do you reckon you were overlooking when you thought it was going to last another 30 years and it didn't? In hindsight, what did you miss?
You know, I remember very clearly a meeting in Port Elizabeth. The Auto Workers Union had their head office in Port Elizabeth, and I was standing in the yard there. It was me and Alec Irwin, who later became Minister of Trade and Industry, and a guy called Freddie Sauls, who was the General Secretary of the Union, and John Gomomo, who was later an ANC MP. And we were talking about whether we should be moving closer to the ANC. In fact, it must have been the early 1980s. I don't remember exactly, somewhere in the 1980s. And I said, no, we don't have to move closer to the ANC. It'll be at least 30 years before there's a change here, so we've got plenty of time to build socialism. You know, when you looked at it from that state, the state seemed very powerful. And the opposition was building up in the townships, in the unions, and in the UDF and so on. But compared to the army and the security police, you know, and bear in mind that although there were sanctions against the apartheid state, they had a lot of cooperation from France and from Israel and from various banks in Germany and other places. So it wasn't as if they were all alone. So, you know, looking at it from the inside, it seemed a very long time before anything would change. And remember, that was also after 1985, state of emergency, 1986, state of emergency. People were detained for a very long time. There were hit squads. The CCB was killing people. Vlakplaas, the hit squad at Vlakplaas, Eugene de Kock was killing people. So yeah, from the inside, it looked like it would take a long time. Of course, we didn't know that there were negotiations ongoing between the ANC and the government. If we'd known that, maybe we would have had a different view.
Right. Okay, any more questions? If not, well, yes. Yeah.
Not a question, but just a comment. And I doubt that Bernie will even remember this, but I think it was a physics conference. There was some conference somewhere that Bernie was at. I think it was probably the first time I actually met him. And, you know, he did a typical Bernie thing. You know, he looked at me across the table and he said, so Justin, no, how can you justify radio astronomy in South Africa? And I wonder what his answer to that question would be now. And of course, I was completely flummoxed. I, you know, sort of fumbled and made some sort of platitudes, but it was, yeah. So Bernie, do you have an answer to that?
Well, first of all, I deny it was me. It must have been somebody else. And secondly, I was saying it in a constructive way because I knew you could justify it. I mean, it was clearly a very important component of development. Now, I'm just joking, Justin. I don't remember the occasion, but in those days, I was, how can I say it, less open to some things than I am now.
It wasn't asked in a particularly adversarial way, but you know, I was young, you were important, and I was just left sort of speechless.
You remember when that was? Was it in the 1990s?
It could have been.
Yeah.
It was pre-94.
Yeah. Well, of course, Rob was pretty much in the lead of the ANC's science desk at that time. So perhaps he should tell you what they were thinking.
He's got to go off to his next meeting though, so maybe next time.
Okay, yeah. But there was already quite a strong view in the ANC and in the other organizations that science was going to play an important part in development. And I think even in the RDP, you'll see that there is recognition of the importance of science and of basic fundamental science as well. But of course, then Rob captured that in a white paper in 1996.
Perhaps an anecdotal story sort of linked to that. Some of you will know Andy Gotts, the kind of inventor of tango. He was Andy Graby back in the day, and here I was South African, did his masters with me, and then went off. Then he went into exile in Germany, went to Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy in Bonn. And the first thing he did when he got to Bonn was to go to the ANC, sort of office there, offering his services to say, he wants to be, an activist to do, against the apartheid government. And the guy said, well, what do you do in your normal life? He says, no, I'm a scientist. And the guy said, no, look, be a scientist. We're going to need scientists in the new South Africa. And took the wind out of Andy's sails as well, because he wanted to sort of become a great activist. And instead he invented tango, which is being used by the SKA.
But I think you'll all find Rob's talk very interesting, because of course Rob was also a scientist when he got involved in the ANC underground and then got locked up. So I recommend that you all attend Rob's talk as well.
Yep, we'll definitely get after him now to give it. Any more questions? Okay, well, if not, well, Bernie, you said no one ever thanked you, but we got to thank you for the seminar, definitely.
Thank
On
you.
behalf of everyone. And to the young people on this call, if you take so long between papers, you'd better have as good as an excuse. All right, any last comments, any last questions? Otherwise, we will close up. And our next speaker in a month's time will be Tiziana. Probably more astronomy than history, but still should be a good talk. If no more questions, then thanks again, Bernie, and we'll see you all next month.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's wonderful.
Thanks, Oleg. And you'll share the recording, right?
Yeah, the recording is being made, so it will be available later today.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bernie.
Thank you.
But Bernie, what you should do is write this all up in a book.
Yeah, that's
Probably more important than the SKA history.
Well, I don't know. Let's see. I'm too lazy is the basic problem.
Bye.
When I need people to remind me of dates, I'll come back to you, George.
Yeah.
All right, thanks again, Bernie.
Bye.
Everyone. Okay, bye-bye.